Hello everyone, I was preparing just another video for today about something we'll talk about eventually tomorrow, but I stopped thinking that maybe it's time I discuss one topic that we have addressed partially already on that video I made on communication, right? There is this playlist which is called Historian, which in ancient Greek means to research, right? And this is what effectively history is. Where there are all these videos that are dedicated a bit more looking at what are we talking about in the first place and how we can do better when talking, reading, studying, learning, searching for history. I think it's a very important topic because we are all in the same boat. We can say we after all like all the same thing. We like history. If you follow Schwerpunkt, it's likely because you have this kind of interests as well. And there are lots of problems. There have always been, historically speaking, and ironically, historically saying. So, in terms of addressing history and authority in history, actually we may analyze today this very simple dichotomy that is kind of the orthodox and the dissident, like if we want to put it in this way. And indeed, this dichotomy does exist. It's a binomium that has its own validity of interpretation in everything. But sometimes I think it's more interesting to discuss effectively the ways such dichotomies work. It's a little bit like when we talk about in von Clausewitz about the theory that can come to help us in many occasions, but that at the end of the day we have to take matter in our own hands most of the times, and because reality challenges us in ways we don't think they could happen. And I think that addressing this topic today is more meaningful than ever. Naturally, we're living in a pretty difficult moment in which we naturally wonder what will be of many things, and the unexpected is something that often shocks us, that makes us think that we were mistaken about a lot of things. This is generally what history does eventually. It's literally about, like, it's really about learning something new which we didn't think could be there, and that instead hits us suddenly and poses us in front of a big problem, which is the one of integrating this further knowledge with what we have fundamentally sedimented and structured already. This is a big problem that I'm not a psychologist nor a there are many scientists that work in understanding how our brain really works in the first place, even at a deeper kind of neurological level. But this is the real problem, is that when we learn things, it's not really a habit that our civilization instilled us, but I think it's automatic in human brain. It is to create a structure, that is to create fundamentally an approximate formula that makes it easier for us to store in mind that concept. And surprisingly enough, this is probably the more effective thing we can do in absolute terms. Like there is all like a dimension of instinctive learning that indeed is the cognitive process proper, like is how we acquire knowledge and how we sediment it even unconsciously. But when we actually think about education, and literally when you go to school, when you go to university, whatever, but even if you read a book simply, under in the shade in summer, you think that you are inherently absorbing certain structures and you're rationalizing that process. You're aware of the fact that you need to fix in mind certain information by saying, okay, now I have to remember this because it's so important. And then just a small part of that knowledge will remain in our mind. It's not that we know by heart the books we read or we study, but it's in fact a sort of synthesis that our mind enables, that is capable of in general, and that is aimed most of the times at retaining what seems, at least for the knowledge that we have already accumulated, in our opinions, what we think can help us further. right? And this process is very complicated. I don't know whether there is a proper historiography or academic field that addresses this structurally. I know that these disciplines that are looking essentially at these are iconoclasts, really, from my opinion. I'm fairly conservative in this regard. I believe that the structures are necessary, even those that seem kind of obsolete because simply they're old. But not everything that is old is outdated. Not everything that is old is bad. Actually, what survives as the classic, as the canon, is actually the process of a great filtering that happens throughout history. Like, think about what are the classics in literature. And we say, before literature was so beautiful, or before cinema was so beautiful, before music was so beautiful. Yeah, you can like this, and definitely what we get from the past very often is mind-blowing, and sometimes we don't realize it fully. But it is true that already at the time there was an enormous amount of production, enormous amount of production that simply got forgotten. Why? Because it sucked, because it was garbage, right? And this happens all the time. And therefore, the more we go on as a civilization at this point, the more we have to remember, right? Which is a very heavy burden to bear, as objectively, and you can see it already generationally speaking. This is something I often say, like that at the time my university professors were studying, like in my level. I mean, they, in order to become expert in a certain field, they had to read, I don't know, 2 or 3 major books, right? Today it's a nightmare. You have to learn many more books for sure, but also this plethora, this enormous amount of articles, of stuff that actually it's also confusing. And this happens because academies are taking a very wrong turn, in my opinion, with this thing of call for papers, this essentially this race just for having one of your articles published. I did it only once, and it was enough. It was disgusting. At this time, I have no time. Like, when I will be done, hopefully, this thing, I don't know when, because now with coronavirus, it will be a mess. I don't even know whether our deadlines for the PhD and all this stuff will be posticipated, but whatever. Trying to stay positive. I will probably do. I mean, I will probably start to write things more and trying to publish them, but not. I refuse this idea that I just have to do it because having it in my curriculum. I actually study and learn history because I like it, which is. And I can do this because objectively I'm lucky enough to afford it, and at the same time it's really what I like for real. Like, of course there are many other things that I like, not everything I write or study I like, right? And this is evident from school, even from university. You can't go out there and learn. I've always been fairly happy to learn. Even when I was in school, I rarely rejected studying as learning such, right? Today maybe I say I could have done much better. Maybe there are certain things that in traditional school systems maybe are not, updated. But still, I am acceptive, let's say, of the formula. I think that the old school model still can offer a lot if it is properly managed. Like, I think there is also kind of a deeper pedagogic need here that involves also discipline. It's not really about just what you learn in terms of quantity. Like, if you had look at my, I don't know, high school yearly program, like if I had learned all of that, like I could have easily, this point, it's the level of a degree. Let's be honest about it. I'm not kidding. It's possibly even more, considering the amount of time spent generally. I'm for homework, for example. I am for massive learning, quantitatively, but also first qualitatively speaking. And I do understand the utility of that still. Maybe we will discuss it on another occasion. But the point I want to make today is how complicated it is. I would say today especially, but the difficulties can be relative also in other historical periods. Even, as I was saying before, in one generation or 1 or 2 generations ago, to effectively have a point of orientation, like let's say a point of reference that can make you I don't know even how to say that, but to be safe, that this is the word I feel to say in this regard, can make you feel safe about what you're doing, how you're doing that, and what you can learn. Now, I haven't prepared this video, so I don't know what I'm being saying specifically, but it's always about the concept of authority, intended as the, you know, the credulity that exists in this world, right? This could easily digress into talking about fake news and all this, but don't think that it is really out of the story, right? First of all, instinctively, as I often say in my videos, I would say that if there is an authority, the best thing you can do is, first of all, understand its role in society. Like, authorities are usually competent. Like, they can make enormous mistakes, and they keep doing it all the time. But it's not a matter of being an authority per se, right? Which instead, in certain countries, even at the academical level, is actually said very often. There are countries where the academies, like the scholars, they come first. Like the first people, if they said that, like, it's certified at the right point. This has caused enormous obstructions, right, in the process of scientific production of, let's say, heuristically speaking, and at the same time, you have to understand what the authority is, if you really want to understand in the first place what it's talking about and how and why. And especially understanding the hierarchy in which it is framed. Like, why is that an authority, right? For example, it's quite common to go out there and say, there is a new theory that circulates on the internet, or something, you read it, you talk about it with someone you know, and maybe someone that is starting to question the validity of this idea, which may sound maybe pretty heterodox in some ways, because maybe it's new, it's kind of, there is this new shock news attitude, even in presenting valid theory, but with this kind of sensationalistic way, and immediately we react by saying, but is this really true? Is it really it? Well, many people, objectively, in different fields, that have no idea whether this can be true or not. And the first thing to tell you is that, but what about true scholars say about this? Like, especially when these things are told by people who are generally not they're new, right? They may be not even scholars proper. They may even come from other disciplines. It does happen, right? When you talk about military history, do not think, and everybody knows, frankly, if you have a consistent military history library, that there are lots of people, like even politicians, like even engineers, economists, who talk profitably about history, even if they're not historians in this sense. We have said many times, what is history? Like, history is more like a philosophical, if not existential, condition proper. Like, we are all historians in a certain measure. What does it mean to be a historian? What does it mean to have a degree or a PhD or whatever? Like, does this really make us more competent, like, about everything we say? And there is a deep problem regarding this, because the authority normally is recognized by someone, and we normally recognize the authority not much, in fact, because of because we understand what the authority is really meaning when they say something, but because it is kind of certified by a certain measure of selection, all right? Which happens all the time. I mean, you have to be heavily selected to become a scholar, right? And it's normal, and it's good. It should be so, and that hierarchical form works, and it is good. It's how it should be in the first place, right? But unfortunately, not everything really works the way it should all the time. There are many factors for which not even scholars can be fully trusted, or at least they should be simply addressed like the ultima ratio, right? If you really don't know if this person tells you how it is, well, you should take that as the ultimate answer. This has caused disasters, as we were saying before. This is very evident, especially in those disciplines that are still very, that need to be explored, or that maybe for some reason there are many of these ones. In social science, think about archaeology, the same history or anthropology and its history during the 20th century. Their history during the 20th century. I mean, these disciplines were born before, of course, but there was a blossoming. There was an enormous development. There are certain methods and ways of approaching and that is very very different from what it has been. And naturally, we have observed that in every scientific field there is a constant updating, right? But it seems to go in waves and steps. Like there is an establishment, a certain generation of scholars that basically comes up with a theory. This theory is taught, and therefore there is a certain consensus behind the authority that is emanating that. And then eventually things go on, new things are discovered, and new researchers, etc., start coming up with certain ideas that at that point are countered heavily by the new generation. If you look at, once again, from the 20th century onwards, it's extremely simple to see how the enormous, almost bullying resistance that certain academic establishments, certain scholars and schools have enacted against new theories. And how, objectively, the point was not much about the evidence of it, but as always, in its interpretation. And interpretation at that point is not really a matter of scientific evidence, but more like a matter of opinion. Now, this is an enormous thing as well, and we should distinguish naturally between science, like hard science proper in certain particular fields, and do not think that even in there are not these atrocious debates. Actually, there are, and they're mind-blowing for their violence, right? But those fields, however, work quite in a different way. When you talk about history or other similar social sciences, the thing starts becoming very interesting. And as I often said, if you study history generally, you get acquainted with people who are pretty reasonable most of the times. I must say I've known people from other fields, like, now I can't say because otherwise whoever is from these fields will hate me. But there are other fields where and I can't explain properly why this is the case, but probably either lack of, there are less sources in general. Like, think about archaeology, for example. Archaeology, for reasons that shouldn't be like this, because I think archaeology should be like history. I mean, we're the same people, technically speaking. We just have different competencies, but this tendency towards hyper-specialization naturally brought the archaeologist to be closer sometimes to a geologist than to a historian, right? And not that the things can't go well together, but there are certain different specific fields of action. And looking at the world through archaeology, for example, is very interesting. And it's we should learn much more archaeology than we do. But at the same time, it revolves, I think, over certain, let's say, I'm not saying necessarily it's negative or positive, but let's say the bigger picture is often much more scanny, right? Because the archaeologist is generally reasoning through the defined, right? And attributes naturally a greater importance. By definition, archaeology is made with money. You have to dig stuff. You can't do so. There are lots there's a lot of competition, a lot of interests around it. I personally know stories about what happened in certain places, including my country, about archaeology and how this still works today. And in terms of the care and the interest in preserving certain artifacts, right? If you the thing gets destroyed by archaeology, actually, and hidden as a consequence. Like, you're digging for finding Roman stuff, you find early medieval stuff, which maybe is less, imposing as a find, etc., but maybe it's just a fence, but you get rid of it because you're searching for the Roman stuff, and that at the point doesn't help you, and you're not quite interested in it. There are lots of things happening in this way. There are very different philosophies also, depending on which country, which institution pays. It does this, it pays for as a consequence, and that gets messy. And there are once again, lots of other interests. Another field like philosophy that I don't know very much, but it seems to me like that it's a completely open space out there. Like if you, I had my share of philosophy exams at university, and it seems to me that there is an enormous heterogeneity in philosophy students and scholars that is, however, directed to topics that I'm not entirely sure they can, um, like, they should be so freely without frame, right? You would expect that in their horizons are, discovered new dimensions, but at the end of the day, you should also value um, what's the utility. Like, to me, I've met, for example, some exams that I've done that I found very useful were about effectively history of philosophy. Like, in high school, I studied 3 years history of philosophy. That's something that I really liked, and that is extremely interesting because it's actual history. It's as if you study literature, right? And you actually study the historical period, the characters, the contents, the ideas, and you have a point of reference there. Elsewhere, sometimes there are new views, there are new visions that definitely help to expand the methods. Even the same history, there's a lot of debate in this regard, but it seemed to me as if, and I'm heavily biased as a historian, so I don't want to say anything against any philosopher that, of course, I appreciate, because I like philosophy very much myself, albeit I kind of lost it along the way. That can definitely lack, they have problems because they lack an actual point of reference, and that's really a problem to me that at least I had when studying philosophy. I found lots of young people that were so fascinated and even talented and smart and so on, but I frankly didn't know what they were going with that. And I've asked them, like, what do you want to do with this? Like, and objectively, they didn't give me an answer. They didn't say, well, I want to do this because effectively this idea can be applied in this way, and for them it was just doing that, right? And I understand that too, because it's still an activity of the mind that is quite important. Anthropology is perhaps one of the single most important, like, disciplines that I wish I had learned myself. Sometimes I hope when I finish these studies now that I could restart from zero, studying anthropology or history of religions, that I find terribly fascinating. I think I have mistaken my I've taken the wrong path, not as a military historian, but as an anthropologist. And we, as military historians, we do need an enormous amount of anthropological knowledge. We do need an enormous amount of a lot of things to only and that's the beauty of history, right? That has many points of references, but there is one standing point in which you should be effectively consistent. I can say that, well, finishing this list of stuff that I've learned, but as far as I know, for example, anthropology enters certain fields that are very usually now they're expanding towards more modern times, and that's essentially the process through which we are starting even to conceive the world globally. This idea that we need more competences. It's probably for anthropologists that there is this greatest shout towards the need of the rightful need of interdisciplinary approach in history. And it poses a lot of problems because anthropologists basically study mankind as such. And it's evident that one thing is studying prehistory, and at that point, even in there, you understand that the ground gets blurred. Like, even anthropology has lots of swings. You can start studying in neuropsychiatry. You can start, I don't know, simple history of literature. You can study war. You can study prehistorical war. A lot of things that seem not to have a real center item, and that's probably one of the fields that is more promising in this regard, because it's exactly the one that lacks more. It's much more similar to history in some ways, because it lacks apparently a true center, but also lacks, and this may be a minus in this regard, a true gluing factor in this all. Like, it seems in history we still maintain that this is broadly a social study. Like, we're not, we can't study, of course, I don't know, the history of a certain specific detailed thing, but first of all, when we study history, we do study effectively about politics, about war, and about society, first and foremost. Then there is also in here a myriad of other fields that open and can be, but at that point they're kind of borderline with other disciplines. And if you, the beauty of history in this regard is that from an apparent blurred base, because literally you could start studying every single damn thing, we have stabilized on this, what is the Clausewitzian trinity, ironically enough: politics, war, and society, and the in creating a sound base instead, which is a miracle if you think about it. I don't think I'm particularly. I mean, historians generally tend to believe they're better than others. We tend to have this idea that getting interested in a bit of everything, we should come to higher knowledge, and because we basically take from a bit from the best of other disciplines and try to put it together to explain certain things that happen and are reliable. It seems that there is a great appreciation towards historians in general, socially speaking. Like, people can't distrust, I don't know, economists, for example. No, it seems these are popular statistics. I don't know personally. I also don't like many historians. I like certain economists. I mean, I don't have a problem in this regard. To me, I respect intelligence, and that's what I care about. But it seems that the historians are seen objectively as people who can give an answer, that can rationalize the objectively very complicated stories proper. Like, you feel like that a historian is generally a person who can answer you the main questions about, I don't know, I'm a medievalist, but I'm sure there are people who ask me about World War II a lot, and it was interesting, it was pleasant, but sometimes I wondered, what were they thinking about? What do people generally think that a historian is? How they trust them so much? How they trust them sometimes even more than scientists at a certain point, and why? Maybe because in science there is this enormous debate, because maybe it gets more political. History is actually very political, and this doesn't seem to bother very much even the audience in this regard. So there are lots of mysteries that I still have to sort out to understand why there is this kind of a general widespread appreciation towards history and people who say history. Now, the real problem, though, is that history has a high degree of inaccuracy. Like, at least this is, from a biased perspective, what we really concentrate on. Like, there are small things that, to a general audience, that they don't even care about, that for historians are an enormous deal, right? It's like when I make these manualistic lessons on YouTube. Like, you have realized at this time that basically I stabilized on one video about kind of warfare in some detail, then another video on kind of manualistic medieval history, and then a third one on von Clausewitz. And for example, when I make the second type, the manualistic one, I must confess you that I do largely agree myself with what I'm saying, but I do realize that pictures are much more complicated than what I say, that very often generalizations are a very easy answer, and that not all the times there is effectively a shared consensus about certain realities. The problem of history is really understanding what this consensus is about. I would say this is the real problem. Like, history in itself, as we've said before, is properly a research. So you may think the actual problem is actually getting into the sources and trying to interpret them fairly, right? And you do, and this is effectively what historians do. But then what the problem is not much the source in itself. Very rarely historians debate over facts, right? The real problem is the consensus that revolves around the interpretation, about the opinion, really, on how to read a certain historical fact or a certain specific evidence given by the sources. So what most people get past is exactly this problem, because they most of the times they don't even know that it's there, right? And therefore, from the other side, I think it's very easy for historians at every level to spot those people who have not posed themselves these problems, in a certain sense tricking them. How do you do that? Well, it's pretty easy. If you look, for example, at many entertainers that exist out there, like there are, I don't know about, in my country, I must say it's fairly common to have certain scholarly figures that go out there that participate to festivals, but I mean not the folkloristic one. I mean actually, intellectual gatherings, and entertain and talk a bit about everything. I mean, they have their own field of competence. They're not charlatans that simply go there and talk about everything, but from, let's say, the top of their authority, right, which is built over consensus in this regard, they start talking a lot, and they even say very interesting things indeed, but not quite everything they say sometimes is correct. And not all the things they do and say are especially addressed in a fashion that, and I don't know whether this is done on purpose, that can kind of help people to understand better history. I mean, take this video here. Here I'm essentially talking to you as if I was one of, a non-historian. Like, I evidently chose this path, and I had my share of years spent about studying certain things. But I can tell you that all the time I don't feel in any way, let's say, sure or let's say confident that what I'm telling you is correct. Like, I think I have a solid self-confidence. I don't have particular problems when it comes to speak my mind. Otherwise, I would have started to talk for hours every day here, making hundreds of videos about the most different stuff. Like, it takes a bit of craziness if you want you introduce certain things. So it's not about me, but it's really about the point of what I say, or for that matter, what everybody says, can have for, let's say, being some form of abuse for possibly for everyone. For example, I have no interest whatsoever, for example, in history as a form of entertainment. Like, I appreciate very much every initiative, from movies to reenactment to, in fact, festivals, whatever. Every chance is good to spread historical awareness. If you got closer to a particular historical period because you watched a very low budget and artistically mediocre and historically inaccurate movie on television, well, fine, right? Better for you. You took that path, and that was fine, right? But there is an inherent danger, I feel, that exists in presenting history, let's say, in presenting history with a kind of a too assertive way. Like, this is the thing, if you don't like it, you're wrong. Like, it's not really about the fact that there is a truth. Like, first of all, always think that every time I make these videos, and in my mind, in my life, for me, there is a truth. Like, I never speak because I think that, everything is opinable. Like, everything effectively is, but this doesn't mean that necessarily has to be correct. Unfortunately, we have grown in a society where what truly matters is not being fair, but simply being good, right? Which is kind of bad. Right, the idea that everybody has an opinion and that therefore that opinion is valid like anyone else. This is not the case, right? And you would say, but you're making a quest now for, like, accepting authority. Well, yes, this is so, but this is exactly what I'm talking about, is that an authority, I mean, everybody has an authority. Like, even between two people who have never studied, two kids that start talking about when you were, I don't know, when you were in primary school about history, there's always the kid which is kind of more authoritative and speaks and talks about history, and other people listen, other kids listen, and they think about that. Authority is not just the one that is at the top. Authority is essentially every person who gets enough consensus. Let's take this exception, not really talking about authority in terms of power, but authority in terms of general acceptance and validation of opinion, of its opinion, by someone, right? And therefore, this is the paradox. When you are used to doubt, you are used also, you have two options. Either you're skeptical, and therefore everything that is presented to you has no value. This is important because being skeptical, maybe not skepticist, is important as well. But being skeptical should be about basically looking at a fact, at a given, or to a notion, and realizing that that could be at the same time either true or false, right? You still don't know that. What it's much easier to do is taking something as immediately either true or false, and fully so, because you have as a reference a specific authority. This can go, take politics, right? Politics, as we often say, is one of those fields where people get less rational in absolute terms. We know it because we are programmed genetically to behave like that. Because in the hunter-gatherers world when we lived, there was no time very often for remaining there to sit and think too much about what would happen. So you had to take the decision, and you had to rely just on certain people that seemed to be more competent, more authoritative, and more effective and capable as leaders, right? But that was an extremely simple world compared to our own, and naturally today we can't address the same things in the same manner, but we do, because we're programmed still biologically, and we will remain so evidently for a very long time. Surely, and quite likely, we will get extinct before that point, which we will remain essentially always instinctively, kind of acting as if it's better to follow the authority for the sake of it than trying to find out the answer by yourself. And this is really a problem of BS, right? Concerning fake news, for example, conspiracy theories and stuff like that, I hate them, right? I hate them, but I don't think it's healthy what is being built in today's society in essentially having this immediate reaction of rejection towards what the mainstream basically refuses at the same time, right? The mainstream can be everything, but it's evident that these are problems, serious problems at a political and social level. That's in fact what politics is mostly about, right? We take extremely stupid decisions for reasons that, all in all, do not seem to be that that valid, even if for a person who doesn't have much of an understanding of politics itself, right? But we still follow certain paths, we still follow certain people, even when we think that maybe it's not such a positive thing. To me, it happens all the time, right? I'm not, I've never, first of all, I've not grown into a political or politicized environment. Like obviously we had always our ideas in my family, but obviously I get it transmitted because that's how it happens most of the times. But it was not about belonging to a party, to that specific even line of thinking. Like even if you take economy, right? It's never fitted into this or that specific school. I liked certain ones. I got infatuated at some point with certain ideas, but I never took them as if they were my only option. And there seems objectively to be a lot of polarization in this regard, and this polarization doesn't help to frame accurately the information in the way we do. Polarization is unavoidable because, once again, the dichotomy in general is really about that. Either it's black or white or red or blue, or whichever color you want to take. Once you have to take a decision, it seems to be more convenient most of the times to be either firmly from one side or firmly from one another, and there is really not a middle ground. This is important for one reason, because at the end of the day, uncertainty and indecision and lack of clarity and health measures are not entirely the best solution. Sometimes it's best to be immediately consistent with a line, and then if it fails, we pass to the other. But losing time in the middle is objectively dangerous. So we have to thank our biological programming for that as well. What instead we're not used, because this is not really instinctive to us, is really thinking that there are other levels in which things can be thought. And as I often say in Schwerpunkt, until you don't get to that point, until you don't elevate your thinking at one point, you don't know that there is that place. And that's really a problem. That's in fact what education should be about. Education shouldn't be passively delivered to kids as if, you simply have to do this now for all these years and then you will be done. You should concentrate on the fact that that's a path for your self-realization as an individual, as a mind, right? And this sense of the achievement as a consistent result should be emphasized more, right? Why is there such and things, and believe me, it is hard. A response, for example, to a traditional education has been, well, okay, it's education sucks today, because objectively, if you go to school, it doesn't seem to learn much anymore. And not that before maybe it was even worse, but it seems that for today's world there is something that should change in this. But it seems the problem there is not much the model itself, but the moral force you apply in it. Like, what could our children be at that point? What could be as an adult if, in these last years there had been just more discipline, or kind of more motivated teachers, or more educated teachers, telling the truth, in a kind of sense of mutual respect and fairness and a sense of purpose and achievement, right? You can't push a system if you don't have the moral force to do that. And that's many of the reasons why, this is much of the reason why objectively many people don't care about learning more in other fields, and for them it seems to be easier to simply stop at one point and then let it go as it goes. It is true that that life is pretty hard in itself, that we can't always learn, that we can't always dedicate to all what we would like the most, but it is also true that there is an inherent demand for fairness, it seems to me. I mean, all this great necessity of, for example, this great interest towards history. Let's be honest, it seems that history is not perhaps this great field of interest for so many people after all. Or let's put it in this way, that the moral force that history is capable of awakening is not as strong as there is in other fields. Why this is the case, I don't know. It's complicated. Maybe we could debate on that at one point. But it seems to me that it has increased at least. I mean, I think it's pretty easy after all, and that's for the same reason for which historians seems to be appreciated. We said before that as historians, as much as historians are appreciated, it seems that also history in general is appreciated. Like, it's very difficult to stop someone in the street and ask, do you like history? You never get interested in history. Said, no, I hate it. I don't want to do it. Or, like, yeah, there are people who do, but it's pretty rare. Like, there are lots of professionals who are not historians that say, I don't know, maybe I'm a doctor, maybe I'm a lawyer, maybe whatever. But you know what, I would like to know more about history because it interests me. Well, that's very common, where it's very rare to find historians to say, I wish I had been a lawyer in my life. I'm a historian, but the dream of my life since I was a child was a lawyer, and I could, like, that's pretty hard to find. Because evidently, we do realize that there is some general importance, and that we can't find answers from the past after all. And don't think that this is just a product of recent years, that interest towards history was lower in the past. There's always been actually a very great amount of interest towards the past, which the longer you go back in time, it seems to have been tied to tradition, to more than more than a memory of a certain amount of knowledge, numerically, quantitatively speaking. It was probably about the quality of it, in a certain wisdom that revolved around it. Think about all the proverbs, all the old sayings that seem to be part of older traditional cultures that were, passing this information down generation after generation, because it was functional to the society they lived in. This is very interesting, and we seem to have lost contact, sadly, very sadly, with those ideas, because this is really a digression, telling the truth, because that has a lot to do with politics and society proper. It hasn't to do with history as in that sense. But it seems to me that history is a vehicle, we could say, for delivering, a sense, maybe not necessary to what we are doing or why we're doing, but let's say to give a safe space of a safe dimension, say, for rationalizing the life we are living. Like, what a world would it be, this one, if we didn't know exactly what happened in the past? Like, how could we react? How could we do anything on our own? How could we solve problems if we didn't know how this fundamentally happened in the past? We can have all the technologies, we can have all the wealth, but if we don't have a let's say an idea of tradition that tells us that what we're doing is somewhat part of a longer and deeper humanity that has been here since ever, much more than we usually think, maybe we could find in our society the way to give the moral force to that is necessary to achieve certain results, right? We live in a society that seems to be very, very lazy, that is losing kinetic energy, right? That has acquired a lot of what we have been struggling for millennia, but that doesn't seem in this regard to be thankful for to those people who came before that rendered this possible in the first place. The problem of authority in this regard is that when you lose this track of the past, it seems that every authority is valid, because if someone simply imposes it with violence, with some means that have properly nothing to do with knowledge, but maybe they're just entertainmental, right? Well, at that point, you can basically build an idea of history that is definitely, it's better than nothing, but that is not necessarily going to help you. For example, why should history be entertaining? Like, I can understand a kid that doesn't know much about history. You gift them with, I don't know, a book about, I don't know, history can be even dinosaurs, but for that matter. We all had our dinosaur phase, I think, when we were little. And that's educational, right? Because the kid likes the animal and the colors and the pictures, etc. But at least he memorizes, he learns, and it keeps with him herself this awareness that there's been, for example, a past. And I remember when I was little, like, I liked a lot to think that it had been this past. I did associate it to certain feelings, to certain emotions, to certain values proper. I think that history has this capacity of reconnecting us with our properly biological in emotions, right? We are driven by emotion. Emotions are not necessarily. It's as if historical knowledge made triggered certain emotions, certain feelings, certain um, behaviors that it's so useless that we try to deny that it's all cultural, like that culture has come, has changed the thing. It's simply we're always the same machine. We just need certain stimulations to keep functioning in a certain way, right? In this sense, culture does have an influence, but it can't erase the biological base for it, right? That's why you can't erase, for example, violence, because that's not a matter of which culture you live, because potentially you always be violent, even if in real life you're not. So yeah, it's fine to reduce, for example, the conditions for which violence can be, triggered, but at the same time, the problem is not violence. The problems are the conditions in which we live constantly. It's the fact that a situation can be more difficult than another one, and there is always a breaking point, and it's difficult to control a human mind after all. And these are once again political and social problems. The authority. What does the authority do in this regard? The authority has an enormous responsibility because as you understand, the potential of historical knowledge and its effects is immense in this way. Like, if you are considered like the depository of a specific knowledge of the past that can awaken such commitment and realizations and dreams and hopes and passions, well, you should be out there to tell out loud what the difficulty naturally that exists in this process is, in the sense preparing people to be able to frame history, history, and as such, meant just even as you approach life in this regard. It's really as a method more than as an actual knowledge, rather than pretending that this is just an exoteric knowledge. It's just the authority knows, that just the scholar can be asked certain things, that can answer certain things, let's say better, that everybody should care only about what the higher spheres think. This is a common thinking. This is an idea that somewhere there is the historian who is really the only person who can access certain things and that can give you a right answer. I don't want to sound an iconoclast or a rebel, which I definitely don't like to be. I stay from the side of orthodoxy. I do stay from the side of authority. I do stay from the side of this general establishment for how we have created our hierarchy. Yes, but as always, this is not a matter of choice. This is a problem too, because when this authority fails you, well, you get pretty disappointed, and probably the more the authority fails you, and the more you tend to react violently from the other side, from the rebel side of the story. So in history, the real problem, I think, is definitely the accessibility, the availability of knowledge of sources, right? This is a great problem that happens all the time. For example, the benefit that a person could have by simply reading a source is immense. To me, for example, reading sources has always been very, very fascinating, very enlightening. I've always preferred to read sources than to read studies, right? And this is a great advantage, in my opinion, because when you read the source, you really need only what we have, unfortunately, because oftenly it's not really much. The study is the authority, is the scholar, is the person who looked at these sources and said, okay, well, according to me, they can interpret it in this way. Now, naturally, that person has studied, is hopefully competent, has a person who definitely knows more than you. So the great attitude, and that's why I stick to the hierarchy in this regard, is always be aware that who who is a specialist in this field does know more than you, very likely, right? That does not only knows more than you, but has that kind of insight and sensitivity and critical skills that you still have to acquire, and you do not know not to have. You don't know what's the difference until you have experienced it yourself by arriving at the point of that person or beyond, when the interesting things start. But at the same time, you should consider always that there is always an enormous potential in the way things can be interpreted from a good point of view. What I mean for a good point of view, I mean for a consistent social achievements. Like there are many theories that are out there, like that are constantly conflicting between scholars, as we have seen before. There is always this sense that there is an inherent conflictuality that leads to debate, to which also people and uninformed people tend legitimately, however, to participate in some ways, trying to understand more, because from that debate you can learn more objectively. Now, the real problem in so many ways is that people seem when people actually go from the side of the scholar, right? They stick to that, and they presume that that's fundamentally all they need to do. That this is a person that for some title or some inherent, from some capacity and ability, can basically answer correctly all the questions. I can tell you that the very first times I began to do things seriously at an academic level, I always disagreed heavily with certain ideas. And the strange thing about it, and I hope that by going on, if I that will happen, is that it was not, as always, in fact, not a matter of facts, of interpretations, but not of details. The problem was not in the detail. The problem was in the general picture, in what this disagreement consisted in. Now, this is an impression that naturally I think confident people tend to have. Like if you are a agreeable person, you just want to avoid conflict, and they okay, well, yes, and you just simply obey to authority in that regard blindly, right? When you have an idea on your own, the point is that you should become the authority. You should become the one that it has enough moral resources, enough aggressiveness, enough combativity, is capable of going out there and saying, look, this is wrong, and I don't care what you think, because here I got this idea. If you don't get in my mind, in the process that in what I learned, in the process that I followed, right, you quite difficultly can understand what I'm even talking about. And what surprises you, that very often the authority even falls on small, like silly things at the same time, which is another trick that happens all the time. It's typical for everybody who starts to learn things at university, for example, to be very attached to this idea that history is fundamentally just learning a lot of things by heart. At least this was the case for me, and I argued sometimes with my professors, because objectively they didn't know certain very important things at the time that were written even on manuals, that they completely, one day I will make a video. All the time I actually risked to not to be expelled by university, but actually of failing an exam and needing to find another class, because I consistently and debunked the professor in front of all the people. And one time, I would say twice, I risked heavily to be even once, not to be aggressed, but to be attacked and becoming, a person shouted against me, and then he was very, very, then eventually he was sorry about that, because I was right in the end. And another person basically I said that she was stupid, and she actually respected. I mean, well, now it's complicated. I can't explain how it happened, but she respected me anyway because objectively, even in there, I was right. And this attitude, I can't tell you, don't do it. Like, if you find a professor you disagree with, do not, please, ask it for yourself. Do not ruin your path simply because you feel cocky and arrogant and kind of you want to appear the hero of the situation. Don't do that. Don't do that. To me, I was lucky enough, but I risked, and I realized today I wouldn't do that anymore. I would be way more diplomatic. And the reason why I did that is also that I was actually also I was feeling for naturally the gap that existed even in there, because I was there to learn, and even if the professors know much more than you do in many ways, but that's why it's kind of impolite to point that out when they make a mistake, and that can be a lapsus, right? All the times you go to university, in every single class, in every single professor of the greatest fame and competence, etc., it doesn't matter what, they will get a date wrong, they will get a name wrong, right? The problem really is when you go beyond that and you start realizing that this authority actually doesn't know what seems to be. This can happen also at the beginning, right? It seems to be really a macrostructural problem with it, right? And I'm not talking about, for example, political ideologies. I fortunately live, I must say, in a country where I actually met politics at university, but I didn't it didn't invest me personally. Like, I never had any kind of ideological debate, and generally speaking, we keep our university is pretty functional, at least when we teach history, and pretty with a very low level of ideologism. And that's what I was telling to you before, is that always be aware that there are other disciplines where it's not fault of the people who are there, that can be the most honest and sincere people, but they're gonna be ideologized. For what I'm concerned, and I think especially medieval history, doesn't seem to be quite the case. I have this impression that ancient historians or modern or contemporary historians are much more ideologized than normally medievalists are. But also in here, I cannot explain why specifically. I mean, I can, because already the Middle Ages are extremely diverse, and yet you still have the opportunity to get in lots of different sources at the same time. The ancient world is still like a very few things, and therefore, if you don't have the evidence, people start denying even the obvious. Whereas when you start talking about modern history, it's like there are certain specific dogmas about modernity and technology and classifications that not even they were invented at the very late modern age, so they're not even very nice towards like you're saying, people who largely lived at least in the early modern era. Contemporary history is, I would say, is barely history. Like it's in the good sense, though. I don't want to say it, but it's so vast that actually I had much more discussions, much more arguments with modernists than with contemporaneous. That, on the contrary, contemporaneous seems to be very fascinated by the Middle Ages, because they realize that the broader picture was largely, in fact, much more chaotic, in some, apparently so, at least in some ways, than the modern age, for example, where generally speaking the contemporaries comes from, because they usually study the two things, like and well, the contemporary history, there's not really a center of gravity as such, right? So there are lots of interest, insights you can find, in this regard. And what I was saying though, is that at one point you do come here, and just to make you an example, I made this article, which was it was the first one I wrote, and it was this conference at my university, so I got into it because normally we organized it ourselves. It was a call for papers. We did it. This was about essentially was the military history of a medieval city I mean, the one I wrote, like the topic was like it was very broad, like you could fit politics, war, stuff like that. And I wrote the history of the city in I think something like 40 years, like 50 years of the story of history of this city. And it was an article essentially centered on the progressive. It was a very of the territorial domination of this city, how they managed it, and against the domestic and foreign enemies, and how eventually this city was swallowed up. Well, this is not an important part by neighbors, etc. And we called as a discussant a, a big authority actually on that specific. He was not a military historian because we have a very few here, but he was he's a scholar about politics and institutions, like so. That had studied heavily that region, that area, and incidentally was from the city. I was researching, and he was very. And one thing that struck me at that point is that, but it's a very very stupid example in my opinion, and but there are actually other things I disagreed with him that were a bit at higher level that. I still believe in, but maybe here it's not the case of discussing because otherwise it gets too long. But that would be interesting to expand at one point on, is that he said something very simple. So this city, we're talking about the 14th century, and the district of this city was covered literally in castles, right? Castles, in this sense, are meant not like the giant things that he started building, especially in the feudal monarchies and from the 12th century onward. They were like yeah, even in stone by that point, but there were literally hundreds. They could be just like fortified houses and towers in the countryside, farms, things like that, with fences, and it figures as castles. Now, for whoever knows the whole picture of not just of that district, of that region or that time, but in general how the Middle Ages were at that point, you know that there is a great continuity, especially in that case, in that region of Europe, on the amount of fortifications that existed scattered all over. Right, Europe was literally covered in castles since at least the 10th century, and this is not a matter of saying, like, it's obvious that the most famous castles, as we were saying before, were others, like, but that's what we often forget, that all the rest of the countryside was full of these fortified positions. Now this guy, who was from that city as well, basically told me after the discussion, and it was not a big deal, just friendly, he told me, look, he was a very good guy, by the way, I like him. He told me, look, I had named one of these castles in the countryside, and he told me, look at this castle, checked out, because at that time it did not exist. Because it was built later in the 15th century. And I said, and I felt strange about it, because basically I had spent 2 months writing this thing, and I had taken a map of the whole area, an historical map, and I had, by the way, the toponyms are still the same today, like, so if you can actually spot the things, I had the same names even just through Google Maps, even if you want, but obviously I had on my the Chronicle I was using, chiefly for that work, I had, there was all the comment, the critic of the text, and there was a list of all these castles, all these places, whichever they were, that were named in the Chronicle, and it was written for each one of them. Like, this is, like, obviously the Chronicle was in Latin. It had like sometimes the name in Latin is different from the one in vernacular of the modern modern language. And therefore it says, look, here in the Chronicle it's named like this, which city is that, which town is that, what castle is that. It tells you the name in vernacular, so you can search for it even in the maps at that point. And it tells you, by the way, in that specific comment also, all the time that this, all the events that in which that castle is named in the Chronicle. And I had even drawn a map here with all the, because I basically was looking at how that city controlled all these various castles around the district, and it was, and I perfectly knew that that castle existed. It was an actual place, still today, in fact, where there is effectively a later construction of the 15th century, but that was effectively rebuilt in a Renaissance style at that point on a pre-existing castle that existed actually since the 12th century. And I didn't write. I checked this better. I already knew it when I discussed the argument when I was talking with the professor, and but I didn't write him back by saying, "Look, this is," or maybe I did. Actually, I think I sent an email to him saying, "Look, this." I didn't want to sound like a jerk, but I at least was concerned about the fact it was one of the greatest authorities. Now, the interesting thing about this was multiple for many reasons. First of all, it impressed me in general that this person that came from that city, that studied the Middle Ages, exactly that era, in exactly that century, because he was an expert actually, not even in the 15th, but the 14th century, and that knew the countryside, knew the places, etc., and had studied politics, institutions, and controlled all of the story of these places, could come to me by telling me, look, this is a castle that before did not exist, or that was built later. Now, you have spent your entire life, as an old person, by the way, studying those things, and you actually don't, even if you have a doubt, even if you do not know, because it's legitimate that you do not know that there was a castle before in the same exact place that eventually was rebuilt in Renaissance times, and it was a castle since hundreds of years there, that was operative, was functional. It's where these guys fought, there were sieges, things. Is it possible you even come to me by saying this is wrong, if you don't have the certainty of it? If you don't, it doesn't come into your mind that it was like literally full of castles there since ever, and you can't think that it may be that the castle existed at the time. Even given, by the way, that my article was actually telling, look, they captured this castle, so on which evidence do you think I made those statements? If the castle had not been there, that's pretty weird. That impressed me. But the thing that impressed me the most, this can be a lapsus, and then this could be a legitimate curiosity. Maybe the guy was just was obviously mistaken, but he could tell me, but are you sure there was this castle at the time? Because I think it was built in the Renaissance. And in fact, I answered him right away. Look, I have checked this. There is this. I told them, because I remember it's in the Chronicle. I read it. It's the Chronicle was from the 14th century, by the way. So no equivocal whatsoever, not even at the beginning. So the question, I wonder, but how this person didn't have the dimension that this was a normal thing and it could be normal, and why did it tell it to me exactly? But the thing that impressed me the most, telling the truth, was that I actually didn't know what this scholar was, or better, what was the problem. I began because this article was part of my research. Partly, it was on the same topic I'm studying, essentially. In fact, I'm still working on these sources and whatever, on the same exact city, etc. And it's become kind of my chronicle. Sometimes you study for a long time a source, it's as if it became your own, right? You don't want other people to touch it, to say things wrong to her. It's like almost with a sentimental relation with it. And I started my research actually that year without knowing much, after all, about those times and places. I didn't. It's pretty weird. I started 3 years of research without actually having a pregress knowledge of that world. I had never read an enormous amount of books about it. I didn't know all these sources, right? And I didn't, by not knowing, especially the historiography, I didn't know what these guys was. Actually, this scholar, was called as a discussant for my article by one of my colleagues that actually directs this call for papers, because I'm terribly lazy and I don't do anything. I'm just, they called it for me because I would have not known who to call. Instead, I didn't know any scholar. I'm terribly ignorant in this regard. I don't care. Like, all these people instead always looking at the academy, all the various academians, what they are, their names, their fame, whatever. Only later on, like, I knew this person had studied, was important, whatever. Only later on, I actually found out what this guy was. This guy wrote an enormous amount of stuff on that period. Like, it's one of the greatest authorities ever. And in fact, I even quoted him for certain things, not very much because it's not, in fact, a military historian, so he was not fully about the things I'm researching, but just for telling me that a person that can be an absolute expert and that has spent literally a lifetime, we're talking about 60 years of work on that time and place, can fail to know in the first place, not just, getting confused about whether that castle existed or not, but not contemplating the fact that it was normal in that world, that it was full of them, and that was actually the very one in the same place from centuries. Now, that's what has made me reflect deeply on the whole thing. I mean, this guy's an authority, but what kind of authority is he? Right? Okay, he's not a military historian, he doesn't know that, but what does he know about the period? Did this guy just study institutions and never wondered anything else? Which is pretty strange, and I know maybe to some of you this doesn't sound as anything meaningful, but I can assure you that for that specific context and that specific world, it's actually pretty strange, especially from a person that even comes from that very place. And it's not that the area is huge, it's actually a very, very small, it's a few tens kilometers squared, like, I mean, per side. What the hell, that's what I thought. Then he criticized me on other things that were objectively important, but even there I didn't quite agree fully with him, and I still disagree. Like, there are lots of things, for example, my tutor is a person that doesn't understand much of what I do, but every time she corrects me, she's actually very reasonable. She even makes very poignant points. Like, I had to review my thoughts, my opinions a lot of times after she told me what I needed to take care of, and I changed sometimes very considerably in my mind. I talked with that person. It's supposed to be much closer to what I studied, to be much more competent. He told me certain things of which I'm absolutely not convinced of, because I came back on them. I had, before doing it, I didn't contemplate it could be wrong. And the more I did it, and the more I realized that actually what was wrong with the thing was generally the perspective, not the fact that I had made a mistake about certain facts. This is very important, but because it comes down even to the method you use. Like, when there is an innovation and there is a resistance, I mean, it's normal, but what's really the deal? Like, the deal appears to me at least, that since there is a certain level of, let's say, originality in something that has never been tried before, because it's been deemed of, to approximate, for example. Now, this is pretty interesting. I can make another example. There is a chapter of my thesis I'm working now. It is also massive because it's really crazy what I'm doing. I never told fully what I'm actually doing at this point, but it's something that I can say I'm repenting of, because I'm still working decently fine for my timeline, and I think I can do it if something doesn't go in the middle here with the coronavirus and everything. The point is, I made a list of contingents. Like, I chose certain regions of my area of interest, and I started to collect basically every single so every single information we have about whichever contingent was ever used in that time. And this is pretty interesting because there are several sources to talk about this. There are certain and sources are generally not so systematic in telling you about these contingents. Like there are sources that can list you very well, like one after the other. Others are much more anecdotal, like they tell you about different stories, and then every once in a while it pops out that there was a contingent. It gives you the number. Other times there are lots of other contingents, you don't know what they are about. So there is all this problem of realizing, for example, the change in relation between cavalry and infantry ratio over time. And you might say that basically looking at 60 years of this history and putting together information coming from different sources, from different, sometimes even from different time, right? Because they could be contemporary sources, it can be from 2 generations later. I mean, there is a methodological problem that is posed, and kind of using that list that is massive, telling the truth, because it's really cumulative of a lot of information, is methodologically speaking crazy. Because you say, but first of all, what are these sources? What are these chronicles about? Because they're mostly narrative sources. Like, you could do this research thinking there are archivistic sources that are there, just ready to be discovered, and that you could do. But I simply don't have time. Like, if you have like thousands, literally, I think I quoted almost 10,000 times. There are 2,000 notes, and I think more than 10,000 quotes. That's so rich that you can't say, well, you can spend 2 months in an archive to find a mercenary contract where there is written just about one company. The chronicles are the only ones that give you the name of the contingents for which they were. Are they reliable? We don't know. But it seems once you take 10,000 of them and you look at what they're really talking about, that a lot of things that are very interesting things come to pop out. First of all, there is a pattern of all these sources. We're talking about tens and tens of sources, even hundreds actually, from this 60 years in that specific region, and they all seem to follow pretty interesting patterns in terms of plausibility of the numbers, of actual similitude and scalar similitude, numerical similitude, the same ratios essentially, and even the same variations of in the ratio cavalry infantry number in the same exact years in various stages of all this thing. Well, what do you think this could be like? Because if you present this to an average scholar, it says, well, this kind of seems pretty fantasy-like, right? But what does turn out from this stuff? Is it a coincidence that this actually follows this pattern? And I showed it, like I demonstrated. It's not that I wondered about it. It's literally there. If I hadn't, like there are exceptions, but if the wide majority of this all speaks in that way, you maybe should take into account. Now, I don't know what will be of this, because I even fear the first chapter is something 300 pages long, and and the first time you think they will say this guy's crazy, and I fear that we'll say, well, when they will correct it, they will say, what the hell, this is maybe too much, and the risk is they will maybe not even read it. They will never even assess that what I found out is concrete, because maybe they have something else to do, maybe have their own problems, right? And therefore, at that point, the opinion of the authority could simply be, oh, well, this one is to be superficial, actually, and saying, well, I don't know, it's pretty strange, maybe he put a lot of effort in this, but I'm not sure about the conclusions point, without even having realized what those sources had said. Now, this is a great problem. There is why there is a peer review, for example, for articles, but we're talking about larger works. The problem is also who's going to read this, and how is it going to be received, and who's going to quote from you, and are people going to be jealous? There's also this problem, like you can at once come to talk about things that nobody has talked about. Basically, I discovered that without knowing anything about the historiography of the time, I began to make this research. In the same, arrived at this point in discovering that the wall historiography has decided to shift exactly in the direction that I had decided to shift, and that I'm beating them over time, because nobody's done anything like this, not even before. And that at that point you realize there is an intuition. And you say, but well, intuition is not really scientific, is it? Well, actually, I think it is, because science without intuition is nothing. I had, for many reasons, maybe I could make an entire video about this one day. I promise that if I finally get my PhD, I will tell you exactly how this thing has gone, because it's actually very interesting, and there is a lot of examples really about this topic of authority and whatever. How my interest was born. And I'm getting amazed by the fact that, of course, after 3 years, I know things that at that time couldn't even imagine, right? 3 years literally spent over these sources. I don't even go to vacation always anymore, and I will not, evidently, at this point for other time. And the thing is that I had gotten right exactly the main conclusions without even doing all of this. And the interesting stuff is also that at the second year, you start entering a different optics by saying, oh my god, now I feel like an imposter because I started with that theory. I didn't even check it out. Well, it's actually what the research should be about, in fact. And instead of the third year now that I'm writing the synthesis, which is really the moment in which you have to say, okay, well, let's finally, tighten the grip on this and see what effectively we got here. Then I was right, and I can tell you this thing happened to me, and it's really, that's really incredible. This is the same thing that happened to me, for example, when I began university. When I began university, I wouldn't trade myself, for that guy. Like I knew much less. I was boring. It was less motivated. I didn't know many things, right, compared to what I know now. But there were things that I knew at the time that I honestly, being even myself, I can't tell you exactly where I got them from. Whether I had get them from the internet, whether I have made an original synthesis by myself, whether I thought about that in certain other contexts, that the first year of university, second year of university, I basically forgot and even got passed by, and I partly began to question. I arrived at the third, fourth year, but even now, I begin to say that actually I was much more consistent on certain convictions at the beginning than I was in the midst of it. What does this mean, actually? Well, this means, in my opinion, that first of all, follow your guts. I think this is a pretty important thing to say in every time, because those are the ones that actually direct you somewhere in the first place, right? You can be wrong easily, but it's fairly difficult to be wrong with a human mind in absolute terms. Like, you can be wrong about something, but you can still adjust the thing to actually put to good use what you have formulated at the beginning as an hypothesis. But secondly, it makes you see, when you address certain specific topics, that you can lose the plot. Like, if you're exposed to too much and you start thinking that that much is more important than what you were thinking because an authority said that, or you're in a pretty dangerous place, right? You're in a pretty dangerous situation. Because you're essentially almost training yourself for those people, and that's bad. That's where authority is actually is made, I believe, because at that point, if you remain firm and you remain objective, you remain consistent with yourself, you can find out a lot of other things, which doesn't mean, by the way, to insist in your obsessions and your delusions. Like, there are lots of people who are just out of their minds, right? I've met, if you go to university, you probably know that it's full of crazy people out there. Like, people who can't believe the unimaginable, and you say, but wait a minute, this person is exposed actually to good information, right? He reads books, all these studies. We attend the same classes, and it is freaking out of mind that way. But there are people like these. But I'm talking about really crazy people, not just like having a different opinion. And the point, and you know why that happens, is because when you arrive there, you are less resistant. Like, you don't have many antibodies to these powerful ideas. You have your set of ideas, but it's kind of small compared to the big ones. So you automatically think that there are so many things to know that at the beginning you completely lose orientation of that. You lose the compass. You don't know which one is true, and therefore you're kind of open to new ideas, which is perfectly fine. You should always remain like that. But at the same time, you make a bit of relativism, because you tend to abandon your previous convictions, and you say, okay, well, probably there is one of these that is right, but I can't tell which one it is. So you stay open to that, and that is dangerous, because sometimes you expose yourself to certain ideas, and you try and they kind of influence you that are actually not good. I mean, they are good because they teach you in this sense that there are, and that you can confrontate with them. But many young people tend to make it a matter of identity, an identitary thing, like, now I embrace this idea because this is my idol, my myth. Now I have this great master, this great talent. I personally never been like that. I would never actually wanted to be like anyone but myself, because I don't care about other people, and I've always been healthily skeptical in this regard. And I but at the same time, I began to appreciate, the more I went on, surely what I had to say, but also what authorities had to say, and at that point framing the authority in a healthier picture, so that, of course, I can forgive the professor for having told me, for that mistake, because guess why? We all make mistakes. That's perfectly normal. The problem comes when we fail to recognize the limit of the authority, and this naturally is proper of the majority of people, because if you're not on a level of the authority, certain things cannot be fully understood. Also, people have a lot of problems in communicating with each other. That's why it's also important to know how to write well or how to speak well, which is very difficult. I have a lot of difficulties in doing this, because I feel that there are important ideas to be put out there, but at the same time, it's difficult to formulate them, especially when you don't, when you lack the instruments to express yourself. There are people who have actually pretty good ideas, and they are very quick where you're awake. I don't know how to say that. But they're not able to express them properly, and that's why sometimes they're even kind of not listened and taken as fools, right? And there are lots of theories. Ask any archaeologist that has studied what we know from in the last 20 years, that are coming out that before were considered like utter garbage, like almost conspiracy theories, right? And that now an incredible amount of evidence is actually finding out. Another thing that happens, I think, especially in history, though, in certain fields that are actually fairly close to it. I mean, periods in history that are consistently documented at the point that you can rarely equivocate what it was really like, right? You can't flip the 14th century. You can find new patterns of interpretations, but what happened there, we know that, right? You can find new stuff, you can perfect it, but the essentials are there. And the messed up stuff is when you have a very few sources, and then something pops out, and that becomes a real thing. That's, for example, why prehistory is becoming soon a very important field of like the next frontier research or certain, because we're realizing that we have deeply overlooked what was before. We are actually mistaking the birth of civilization, even of different millennia. There is here now, you think I'm nuts probably, but I'm not kidding. There is a substantial amount of scientific evidence that this is the case, and it's growing, right? And there has been a consistent obstacle put to these theories out there. So sometimes, even the fact of being young, I must say, I don't like to complain. I like to be all but a victim. But it is not easy to be young in this regard, because you may think that you do perceive that people do not take you seriously, and most of the times they are right. That's why it's so hard, because you realize that most times you don't stand a chance against someone. But as long as you go on and you become aware of it, well, that's an enormous advantage, especially the sooner you acknowledge this, and the more you can do, and the more you can surprise others. I think there was another concept I wanted to say was fairly interesting, but I can't remember now. But the point, in general, is there. It gets down to a simple question. I would say is then how can I trust an authority? Like, how should I trust if I don't have the instruments to trust an authority? How do I do? Well, there are not many other ways than taking the same path. Like, the studies are always tricky in this regard. I can tell you that the general impression I received, if you want to start studying something seriously, is that either you have a very clear, complete picture from I don't know where about a certain amount of, how much there is there. Like, for example, it's dramatically important to have, before you start any research, all the sources in front of you. Like, you know that those are the only sources that you need. That is a big problem, isn't it? Like, if you study the ancient world, of course, that's that's a joke. It's so easy. There are only those sources. Start doing this from the 13th century, for the 14th century. There is not an unequivocal picture of an immediate realization of which sources, for which places, for which times. If there are complete lists, who were the authors, when they wrote it, it starts becoming fairly difficult, and that can be a big limit. Equally, you should know how many how many studies have been written on this stuff, and that can be a problem too, because studies are long. Usually, sources very often are open access, fairly available. But even in there, it's not that easy. But in terms of studies, you have to pay for them normally, and it's not that easy as well. So you have to go to the library, take pictures of it. It's difficult at the same time. You have to have the updated version of the text. That's also important, because maybe you make a research on a text that you thought it was the newest edition. Instead, it's not, and therefore who revises you says, but there is a newest version. Why did you work on it like this? And there are lots of problems, really, that have to do largely also with the the general interest that exists in these times and places. Today, the frontiers of research are normally in those fields that are so crazy and so unusual and unexplored, that they represent, the El Dorado in that regard, because nobody has been there, so it's a virgin soil, and you can't say, well, all right, wherever I find it's something good, right? But this is also a pretty bad attitude, in my opinion, because actually we know a lot of things already, and everybody knows that you can virtually discover an infinity of things simply from things that we already know. And this is in fact the problem with authorities, that the authority normally says, in books you can find, well, this scholar has already written about this, there's nothing else to know now. I did find it, and I wrote a thesis of, I think, 1,000 pages at this point, not even needing to prove that that person was wrong, because those 1,000 pages were by themselves the evidence that there is much more to say about what the scholar had written, right? But the fact that other scholar thought that everything had been said, right, that is the problem. Because when I read that line the first time, he said, damn, then there is not much I can say then. And the reason why I felt like I did is that I read that study that was completely useless to me at the same time. So that's why I say beware of historiography. Make a lot of attention to that, because you can't write as a scholar, like nobody can write anything about this anymore. He can, if, let's say, this can happen in determinate fields. Like, it's obvious that, take a source, for example. You want to make a philological research on it, and there is a great philologist and linguist who already made all the critical study of that source, and has studied everything, all the manuscripts, and you arrive there and you say, no, I want to do it myself. Well, okay, unless you're kind of way better than this person, you have something, you can't do much more in that regard. It's fine. But when we come to history in general, like when it's objectively a political and military, a social history, well, that starts becoming a bit more debatable. Like, everything can be expanded, and it often happens that exactly those fields where people think generally that everything is being said are exactly the ones that should be recovered and reread and readdressed. It's a problem of method. It's also a problem of ego. Like, lots of people don't like that others touch their thing, right? It's my topic, it's my research. We are all pretty jealous about it. But at the same time, it's also a matter of how good you're able to explain the matter itself, because you should always find a good reason to pose a question, right? And this is also not so clear. It's very difficult to pose questions, also because you still don't know what possible answers you can get. It's a very confusing process. Probably the most difficult part of these researches is not even actually carrying them out, but is making a point of why they should exist. And you're going to be evaluated chiefly on that, I presume. And it's a great problem, especially because if you don't like to get into the technicalities of formalities, let's say better, and you simply want to say the thing for how you found out that is, you don't need to explain certain. I mean, the person who knows about the period should have the instruments to understand its importance. This is often not so, and why? Because authorities usually are getting hyper-specialized, so they don't even know what they're saying themselves anymore. They don't know their field of expertise anymore. Their alleged field of expertise becomes always narrower, at the point they can't even realize what's all around them. This is a serious problem. I wouldn't under-evaluate, I wouldn't overlook it, because I think every researcher at this point is facing with these problems, right? There are a lot of people who simply want to be kind of, the prima donnas, right? They want to take the shortcut, they want to do something that pays them. I don't think that's a good idea. Like, if you have a good idea on your own, that's what works for itself, right? If you have the passion, if you have the consistency, the patience, and the devotion to do it, well, that really becomes something important, right? The rest will be forgotten because we can't do without certain things. So that's why I think that even, like, it's important to make an effort, because you can't pretend that there can be a progress without effort, without a sacrifice. This is something we're forgetting day after day. We are essentially given for granted what we have, because we don't sweat and bleed for it anymore, and that's really sad, because it's as if we had forgotten all the sacrifice that those who came before us made for putting us in the condition of doing what we can do now, and we simply say, okay, we'll take the easiest path because who cares, right? And it's like this in many fields, right? I think most people reason like this because it's more convenient, it's easier, right? And I understand them. There are many other problems too. But you can't pretend that problems will be solved simply by someone else. You have to take responsibility for everything, and there's nothing you can do. So, on the long run, that excludes this possibility. All right. Well, I think we can stop for today. I don't know. I simply started with this. I didn't know even 5 minutes before that I would make this talk. So I'm at least glad that I'm able to speak freely about these topics without um, too much to think to plan, right? And so for now, I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.